In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a star ballerina, Clara Varney, dazzles the stage in Giselle, until a scream shatters the applause and she's found strangled with her own crimson ribbon. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose gentle demeanor hides a razor-sharp mind. As whispers of jealousy, obsession, and hidden debts swirl around the ballet company, Miss Marple unravels a web of motives: a temperamental choreographer, a spurned stage manager, a devoted fan, and an ambitious rival. With her knitting needles clicking and her keen eye on every glance, she follows the ribbon's trail to a shocking confession, proving that even in a quiet village, passion can turn deadly. Chapter 1. The Final Curtain. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and sleepy lanes, rarely stirred to such a pitch of excitement as it did on that crisp autumn evening. The old assembly hall, usually host to amateur dramatics and the occasional whist drive, had been transformed for a rare spectacle, a performance by the renowned Varney Ballet Company from London. The villagers, unaccustomed to such sophistication, filled the creaking wooden seats, their whispers humming like bees in a clover patch. Miss Jane Marple, seated primly in the second row, her black lace mittens clutching a small knitting bag, gazed at the stage with quiet anticipation. Her sharp eyes, framed by spectacles, missed nothing, not the flutter of a program in a nervous hand, nor the faint creak of the hall's ancient rafters under the weight of expectation. The curtains parted, and Giselle began. Clara Varney, the company's star, floated onto the stage, her white tulle skirt catching the gaslight like mist over a moonlit pond. Her movements were a poem of grace, each arabesque and jeté defying the earthly pull of gravity. The audience, rustic though they were, held their breath as Clara spun through the tragic tale, her dark hair gleaming under the spotlight, her face a mask of ethereal sorrow. Miss Marple, though no expert in ballet, appreciated the artistry. Her needles clicked softly in her lap, a counterpoint to the orchestra's swell, as she observed not just the dance, but the people around her, their rapt faces, their subtle shifts, their unspoken stories. As the second act reached its climax, Clara's portrayal of Giselle's heartbreak drew gasps from the crowd. Her final pirouette, a whirlwind of silk and sorrow, ended with her collapse in the arms of her stage lover, Albrecht. The curtains fell, and the hall erupted in applause, a wave of admiration for the fleeting magic they had witnessed. Miss Marple clapped politely, her mind noting the fervor of one man in the front row, his hands beating together with almost desperate enthusiasm. But before the applause could fade, a piercing scream cut through the din, sharp and raw, from somewhere behind the heavy velvet drapes. The audience froze, murmurs rippling like wind over water. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her head tilting slightly, as if catching a scent on the breeze. The hall's manager, Mr. Percival Higgs, a stout man with a penchant for order, hurried to the stage, his face pale. "Please, remain seated," he called, his voice cracking. But curiosity, that most human of impulses, stirred the crowd, and whispers of, "What's happened?" and "Is someone hurt?" filled the air. Miss Marple, with the unhurried calm of one who had seen many dramas unfold, gathered her shawl and slipped toward the side door leading backstage. Mr. Higgs, recognizing her as the vicar's old friend and a woman of uncanny insight, did not protest when she murmured, "I might be of some assistance, Percival." Backstage, chaos reigned. Dancers in their ghostly Giselle costumes huddled in knots, their faces smeared with grease paint and fear. Stagehands stood frozen, tools dangling from their hands. In the dim light of a single hanging bulb, Clara Varney lay crumpled near a coil of ropes, her white costume stark against the dark floorboards. A crimson ribbon, part of her costume, was wound tightly around her throat, its ends trailing like bloodstains. Her eyes, once so expressive, stared blankly at the rafters above. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she took in the scene, her mind already threading together the first strands of a pattern. The local constable, young Tompkins, arrived, his face flushed with the weight of responsibility. He stammered orders to secure the area, but his eyes darted nervously to Miss Marple, as if hoping she might take charge. She did not, of course, she never did, but her presence was a quiet anchor. Kneeling carefully, her knees protesting the cold floor, she studied Clara's body. The ribbon was tied with a precise knot, not the work of a panicked hand. The girl's face showed no sign of a struggle, only a faint bruise on her cheek, barely visible under her stage makeup. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the surrounding chaos. A toppled chair, a scattered pile of programs, a single wilting rose lying a few feet away. The company's choreographer, Maurice Duval, pushed through the crowd, his angular face taut with anger. "Mon Dieu, what is this madness?" he demanded, his French accent slicing through the murmurs. Elise Caro, Clara's understudy, stood nearby, her eyes wide but curiously dry, her hands twisting the hem of her costume. Tom Rigby, the stage manager, hovered at the edge, clutching a clipboard as if it were a shield. And there, lingering near a prop table, was the man from the front row, his face pale, a bouquet of roses now drooping in his grip. Miss Marple noted each of them, their postures, their glances, their silences. Murder, she knew, was not merely an act, but a performance, and every performer left clues in their steps. "Poor Clara," Miss Marple murmured, rising with a sigh. "Such a talent, extinguished so soon." Her words were soft, but her eyes were sharp, already piecing together the threads of motive and opportunity. The stage, she thought, was set for a very different drama now, one she intended to unravel. Chapter 2. The Company in Chaos. The assembly hall of St. Mary Mead, so recently alive with the enchantment of Giselle, now hummed with a different energy, a discordant buzz of fear, suspicion, and whispered conjecture. The heavy velvet curtains drawn back to reveal the tragedy hung like silent sentinels over the backstage chaos. Clara Varney's body, still lying where it had fallen, was now covered with a coarse tarpaulin, a makeshift shroud that did little to soften the grim reality. Constable Tompkins, his youthful face etched with unease, had roped off the area with a length of twine scavenged from the stage props, his hands trembling as he knotted it. The villagers, reluctantly ushered out of the hall, lingered outside in the chill autumn air, their voices carrying snatches of speculation that drifted through the open stage door. Miss Jane Marple, her small figure unassuming in her black wool coat and sensible hat, stood just beyond the twine barrier, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Mr. Percival Higgs, the hall's manager, had insisted she stay, citing her reputation for sorting things out during the village's occasional scandals, a lost heirloom here, a disputed will there. Miss Marple had demurred, as was her habit, but her keen eyes, bright behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The backstage area was a labyrinth of ropes, pulleys, and discarded props, its shadows deepened by the flickering light of a single overhead bulb. The dancers, still in their ghostly costumes, huddled in small groups, their whispers sharp with panic. Stagehands stood idle, their tools forgotten, while the company's principal figures, each a potential player in this grim drama, moved uneasily under Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. Maurice Duval, the choreographer, was the first to draw her attention. A tall, wiry man with a hawk-like face and a shock of dark hair streaked with silver, he paced near the stage wings, his gestures as theatrical as the performance that had just ended. His voice, laced with a French accent, cut through the murmurs like a whip. "This is intolerable," he snapped, addressing no one in particular. "The company must continue. Clara would have demanded it." His hands, expressive and long-fingered, waved dismissively toward the covered body, as if death were a mere inconvenience to his art. Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to the other dancers, assessing their reactions. Was it grief, she wondered, or something more calculated? She recalled a village dance instructor, years ago, whose temper had masked a deeper insecurity. Duval, she suspected, was not so different. Nearby, Elise Caro, Clara's understudy and rival, stood apart, her slender frame wrapped in a shawl that failed to conceal her trembling. Her pale face, framed by auburn curls, was a study in affected sorrow. Her lips quivered, her eyes glistened, yet Miss Marple detected no tears. Elise clutched a small mirror, adjusting it nervously, as if ensuring her grief was properly staged. She had been Clara's shadow, always one step behind, her talent overshadowed by the star's brilliance. Miss Marple's mind flickered to a young seamstress in St. Mary Mead, who had once sabotaged a rival's dress out of envy. Ambition, she knew, could twist the heart as surely as a ribbon could choke a throat. Tom Rigby, the stage manager, was a different sort altogether. A stocky man with thinning hair and a perpetually harried expression, he hovered near a stack of crates, his clipboard clutched like a talisman. His eyes, small and darting, avoided the tarpaulin, focusing instead on the ropes and pulleys overhead. Everything was in order, he muttered to a stagehand, his voice low but insistent. The lights, the cues, perfect, as she wanted. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on his hands, noting a faint tremor and a curious bruise on his wrist, half hidden by his cuff. A clumsy accident, perhaps, or something more. She thought of a local carpenter who had once bruised his hands in a fit of rage. Bruises, she knew, could tell stories. The fourth figure, less central but no less intriguing, was Mr. Henry Tate, the fan who had clapped so fervently from the front row. He stood near a prop table, his bouquet of roses now wilting in his grip, their petals scattering like confetti on the dusty floor. A man in his late 40s. With a soft face and anxious eyes, he seemed out of place among the company's polished chaos. His coat, expensive but ill-fitting, suggested a man striving to belong. He murmured to himself, his words inaudible, but his distress palpable. Miss Marple recalled a village shopkeeper who had once followed a traveling singer with similar devotion, his admiration teetering on obsession. Tate's presence backstage, so soon after the murder, was a thread she would need to unravel. Constable Tompkins, overwhelmed by the scene, approached Miss Marple with a mixture of deference and desperation. "Miss Marple, I don't know where to begin," he admitted, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "This isn't like a stolen bicycle or a poacher's trap. It's murder." His voice dropped to a whisper on the last word, as if naming it might summon further calamity. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile, her tone gentle but firm. "Begin with what you see, Constable. The truth is always there, waiting to be noticed." She gestured subtly toward the body, her eyes guiding him to the details she had already observed. The precise knot of the crimson ribbon, the absence of scuff marks on the floor, the single rose lying just out of reach. Tompkins nodded, emboldened, and began questioning the company, his notebook trembling in his hand. Miss Marple stepped back, her presence fading into the background as she observed the suspect's reactions. Duval's impatience flared as he answered, his voice rising when asked about his whereabouts during the final act. "I was in the wings, directing the dancers," he snapped. "Clara was perfection. Why would I harm her?" His words were bold, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes, a slight tightening of his jaw. She thought of a village doctor who had once lied about his whereabouts during a theft, his confidence betrayed by such small tells. Elise, when questioned, spoke softly, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "I was in my dressing room, preparing for the curtain call," she said, her eyes downcast. "Clara was everything to me. I can't believe she's gone." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple noticed her grip on the mirror tighten, her knuckles whitening. The dressing room, she recalled, was mere steps from the stage door where Clara was found. A convenient alibi, perhaps too convenient. She thought of a young governess in St. Mary Mead, whose tears had masked a calculated theft. Elise's performance, she suspected, was no less deliberate. Rigby's answers were curt, his eyes fixed on his clipboard. "I was at the lighting board, checking the cues," he said, his voice flat. "Clara was particular about her spotlights." When Tompkins pressed him about the bruise on his wrist, he tugged his sleeve down, muttering about a heavy prop. Miss Marple's mind turned to a local farmer who had once hidden a guilty secret behind a similar brusqueness. Rigby's discomfort, she noted, was a thread worth pulling. Tate, the fan, was the most forthcoming, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I was backstage, hoping to see Miss Varney," he admitted, his face flushing. "I always bring her roses. She smiled at me once, you know, in London." His devotion was almost painful to witness, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the scattered petals near Clara's body. Had he been closer to her than he claimed? She recalled a village lad whose puppyish adoration had turned to spite when rejected. Tate's roses, she thought, might hold more than sentiment. As Tompkins continued his questioning, Miss Marple moved quietly through the backstage area, her steps slow but purposeful. The stage was a maze of nooks and crannies, each corner hiding potential clues. A discarded program, its edges crumpled, lay near a coil of rope. A small vial of smelling salts, its cap loose, rested on a prop table. A faint smudge of grease paint marked a door frame leading to the dressing rooms. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the door frame, her mind cataloging the smudge's height, too low for a stagehand, too high for a child. A dancer, perhaps, moving quickly in the dark. She paused by the stage door where Clara had been found. The area was narrow, shadowed by a heavy curtain, a perfect spot for an ambush. The ribbon, she noted, was not torn or frayed. Its knot was tight, deliberate, the work of someone with steady hands. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a village seamstress who had once tied a knot with similar precision, hiding stolen goods in a bundle. The ribbon, she suspected, was no random choice. It was part of Clara's costume, accessible only to those close to her. The company, then, held the key. Miss Marple returned to the group, her presence barely noticed as the suspects argued among themselves. Duval was now berating a stagehand for a misaligned spotlight, his voice a mix of frustration and bravado. Elise had retreated to a corner, her mirror now tucked away, her face composed, but her hands still twisting her shawl. Rigby scribbled furiously on his clipboard, as if documentation could ward off suspicion. Tate lingered by the prop table, his roses now abandoned, his eyes darting nervously toward the tarpaulin. Constable Tompkins, his notebook filled with scrawled notes, approached Miss Marple again. "They all claim they were busy," he said, his voice low. "But no one saw each other, not clearly. It's a muddle, Miss Marple." She nodded, her expression serene, but her mind racing. "A muddle, yes," she said softly. "But every muddle has a pattern, Constable. We need only find the right thread to pull." Her eyes flickered to the suspects, each a piece in the puzzle she was beginning to assemble. As the night deepened, the company was dismissed to their lodgings at the village inn, under strict orders not to leave St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the stage one last time. The tarpaulin, the ropes, the scattered petals, all were silent witnesses to Clara's final performance. She thought of a village girl who had once hidden her guilt behind a mask of innocence, her crime revealed by a single careless detail. Clara's killer, she knew, had left such a detail. She need only find it. With a final glance at the darkened stage, Miss Marple adjusted her hat and stepped into the cool night air. The village was quiet now, its excitement replaced by unease. But Miss Marple's mind was far from quiet. The company's chaos, she knew, was a performance in itself, each suspect playing a role. She would watch and listen and wait, for the truth, like a dancer's misstep, would eventually reveal itself. Chapter 3. Whispers of Motive. The morning after Clara Varney's murder dawned gray and damp over St. Mary Mead, the mist curling around the village's thatched roofs like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple sat in the vicarage's cozy parlor, invited for tea by Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose enthusiasm for local gossip was matched only by her generosity with scones. The vicarage, with its chintz curtains and polished oak, was a hub of village chatter, and today it hummed with the tragedy at the assembly hall. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, listened as Mrs. Clement and her guests, a trio of village matrons, dissected the ballet, company's scandal with relish. Their voices, though hushed out of respect for the dead, carried the eager edge of those who sensed a story to unravel. "Such a dreadful thing," Mrs. Clement said, pouring tea with a practiced hand. "Clara Varney was a vision, wasn't she? Like an angel on that stage. Who could do such a thing?" Her eyes, bright with curiosity, darted to Miss Marple, inviting her to weigh in. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing as she sipped her tea, the delicate china cup warm in her hands. "A terrible loss," she murmured. "But people, you know, are rarely what they seem." Her tone was mild, but her words landed like pebbles in a still pond, rippling through the conversation. Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say that French choreographer, Monsieur Duval, was furious with Clara. My cousin's girl, who helps at the inn, overheard him shouting at her last week, something about her ruining his vision." She nodded sagely, as if this settled the matter. Miss Marple's mind flickered to a village schoolmaster who had once masked his envy with bluster. Duval's temper, she thought, might hide more than artistic frustration. Mrs. Bantry, a florid woman with a penchant for dramatic pronouncements, chimed in. "It's that understudy, Elise Caro, I'd wager, always in Clara's shadow, poor thing. My nephew saw her at a performance in Bath. She danced well, but Clara outshone her. Jealousy is a wicked thing." She shook her head, her earrings jangling. Miss Marple recalled a young housemaid in St. Mary Mead, whose envy of a rival's engagement had led to a spiteful act. Elise's dry-eyed grief, she noted, warranted closer scrutiny. The third matron, Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a nose for scandal, pursed her lips. "Don't forget that stage manager, Tom Rigby. My grocer says he was always muttering about Clara's demands. Lights this, curtains that. A man pushed too far might snap." She tapped her teaspoon against her saucer for emphasis. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a local gardener whose quiet resentment had once erupted in a petty theft. Rigby's bruise, she mused, might hint at a temper less controlled than he let on. "And then there's that strange man with the roses," Mrs. Clement added, her voice tinged with unease. "Henry Tate, they call him. Follows the company everywhere, like a shadow. My maid saw him at the inn, writing letters, dozens of them, all about Clara. It's not natural, is it?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, remembering a village boy whose obsession with a traveling actress had ended in public humiliation. Tate's devotion, she suspected, might have a darker edge. As the tea party continued, the women's chatter wove a tapestry of motives, each thread colored by village hearsay. Miss Marple listened, her face serene, but her mind alert, sorting the gossip into patterns. The vicarage clock chimed 11, and she set her cup down, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "People talk," she said softly, "and in their talk there's often truth, though it's tangled up with fancy. We must look at what was done, and who stood to gain." The matrons nodded, though their eyes betrayed a hunger for more immediate answers. Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return for evensong, and stepped into the misty village street. Her destination was the inn where the ballet company was lodged, a sturdy old building with ivy-clad walls and a creaking sign. The landlord, Mr. Dobbs, a jovial man with a knack for remembering faces, greeted her warmly. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he said, wiping a glass behind the bar. "The dancers are all in a state, hardly eating, hardly sleeping." He leaned closer, his voice lowering. "That Monsieur Duval was up half the night, pacing his room. I heard him muttering in French, sounded angry." Miss Marple thanked him, her eyes scanning the inn's common room. A few dancers sat at tables, their faces pale under their stage makeup, which they had not fully removed. Elise Caro was absent, likely in her room, but Tom Rigby sat alone in a corner, his clipboard replaced by a pint of ale. His eyes were fixed on the window, though Miss Marple doubted he saw the misty street beyond. She approached, her step light, her smile disarming. "Mr. Rigby, might I trouble you for a moment?" she asked, her voice as gentle as a grandmother's. Rigby started, his ale sloshing slightly. "Oh, Miss Marple, didn't see you there. What do you want?" His tone was gruff, but his eyes held a flicker of unease. Miss Marple settled into a chair opposite him, her knitting bag on her lap. "Just a word about poor Clara," she said. "She must have been a challenge to work with, so particular about her performances." Rigby nodded, his fingers tightening around his glass. "She was. always wanting this light brighter, that curtain faster. Drove me mad, but I managed. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his thumb rubbed the bruise on his wrist as if it pained him. "Did you see her after the performance?" she asked, her tone casual, as if discussing the weather. Rigby's eyes narrowed. "No, I was at the lighting board, checking the rigging. She was alive when I left her." His words were clipped, and Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "Of course," she said. "It must be hard, keeping everything just so for such a star." Rigby grunted, his gaze returning to the window. Miss Marple rose, her mind noting his defensiveness, the bruise that seemed to itch under his scrutiny. Next, she sought out Henry Tate, who was in the inn's small garden, sitting on a bench with his wilted roses. His face, soft and lined, lit up at her approach, mistaking her for a fellow admirer of Clara. "She was a goddess," he said, unprompted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've followed her from London to Bristol, every performance. She deserved better than this." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes on the roses, their stems crushed in his grip. "You were backstage last night," she said gently. "Did you see anything unusual?" Tate flushed, his hands trembling. I just wanted her autograph. I didn't see anything, I swear." His eyes, however, darted to the inn, as if fearing pursuit. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind filing away his agitation, the roses that matched the one near Clara's body. As she returned to the village, Miss Marple passed the assembly hall, where Constable Tompkins was overseeing the removal of Clara's body. The crimson ribbon, now in a police evidence bag, caught her eye as Tompkins held it up. "Strange thing to use," he muttered. "Part of her costume, they say." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the ribbon's significance. It was no random weapon. Its choice suggested intimacy, access, intent. She recalled a village girl who had once used a scarf to hide stolen silver, the personal nature of the item betraying her. The ribbon, she thought, pointed to someone within the company's inner circle. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The village gossip had painted a picture. Duval's temper, Elise's envy, Rigby's resentment, Tate's obsession. Each had a motive, each a shadow cast by Clara's brilliance. But motives, she knew, were only the beginning. Opportunity, means, and that indefinable spark of intent, these were the threads she must weave together. She thought of a village wedding, where a jilted lover's smile had hidden a heart full of spite. Clara's killer, she suspected, wore a similar mask. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple's eyes fell on her knitting, a pattern emerging from tangled wool. The village, the inn, the stage, all were part of the design. She would visit the company again, listen to their words, watch their glances. The truth, she knew, was like a dancer's step, precise, deliberate, and waiting to be seen by those who knew where to look. Chapter 4. The Choreographer's Temper. The mist that cloaked St. Mary Mead had lifted by mid-morning, leaving a crisp clarity that sharpened the village's outlines. The stone church spire, the crooked chimneys, the glint of dew on the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, her black coat buttoned against the chill, made her way to the rehearsal studio at the edge of the village, a converted barn loaned to the Varney Ballet Company for their stay. The studio's weathered doors creaked as she entered, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her presence as unassuming as a sparrow in a storm. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rosin and sweat, and the sharp notes of a piano clashed with the shouts of Maurice Duval, the choreographer, whose temper was as much a performance as the dancers' pirouettes. Duval stood at the center of the studio, his lean frame taut with energy, his dark eyes flashing as he directed a group of dancers through a pas de deux. "Non, non, non," he barked, his French accent slicing through the music. "You move like a cow, not a sylph. Again." The dancers, their faces strained, reset their positions, their point shoes scuffing the wooden floor. Miss Marple settled onto a bench near the door, her needles clicking softly, her eyes taking in the scene. Duval's temper, she noted, was not merely artistic. It had an edge of desperation, as if his authority teetered on the brink of collapse. She had come to observe Duval, whose name had surfaced repeatedly in the village's gossip. His clashes with Clara Varney, the murdered star, were no secret. Her defiance of his choreography had been a thorn in his side. Miss Marple recalled a village organist whose pride in his music had masked a deeper need for control. Duval, she suspected, shared that need, and Clara's independence may have threatened it. As the rehearsal paused, she rose, her step light, and approached him with a smile that disarmed his scowl. "Monsieur Duval," she said, her voice soft as a hymn, "might I have a word? I so admired your work last night, despite the tragedy." Duval, wiping sweat from his brow, eyed her warily. "You are the lady from the village, yes? The one who asks questions." His tone was sharp, but he gestured to a folding chair, his manners overriding his irritation. Miss Marple sat, her knitting bag on her lap, her eyes noting the gold watch on his wrist, its face gleaming with an elegance that seemed at odds with his rumpled rehearsal clothes. "A terrible loss, Miss Varney," she began, her needles resuming their rhythm. "I understand you worked closely with her. She must have been a challenge, so spirited." Duval's lips tightened, his fingers brushing the watch as if it were a talisman. "Clara was difficult," he admitted, his voice low. "She had talent, oui, but no discipline. She refused my new choreography for Giselle, said it was too modern, too bold. She wanted her own way, always." His eyes flicked to the dancers, who were now stretching at the bar, their whispers a soft undercurrent. Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on Elise Caro, the understudy, who moved with a calculated grace, her auburn curls catching the light. "Yet you created such beauty together," Miss Marple said gently. "It must have been frustrating to have your vision challenged." "Frustrating?" Duval's laugh was sharp, almost a bark. "It was maddening. Hours I spent, crafting steps for her, and she threw them back in my face." He caught himself, his voice softening. "But I would not harm her. She was my star, my muse, even if she drove me to despair." His words were fervent, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a flicker of unease, a slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his watch. She thought of a village painter whose passion for his art had hidden a secret debt. Was Duval's watch, she wondered, a gift, as he claimed, or a sign of something less savory? "And where were you, monsieur, after the performance?" she asked, her tone as mild as if inquiring about the weather. Duval stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "In the wings, directing the curtain call. Then I went to my office to review notes. I saw nothing of that." His gesture toward the stage was vague, dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers clenched, the watch glinting as if mocking his composure. She smiled, thanking him, and returned to her bench, her mind threading his words with the village gossip. Duval's temper, she knew, could be a mask for deeper motives, pride, perhaps, or something more personal. As the rehearsal continued, Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the dancers, their movements a silent language of ambition and rivalry. Elise Caro, now taking Clara's place in the center, danced with a precision that bordered on ferocity, her eyes fixed on Duval, as if seeking his approval. Miss Marple recalled a young dressmaker in St. Mary Mead, whose diligence had hidden a burning envy. Elise's rise to the lead role, so soon after Clara's death, was a thread worth examining. She noted, too, a young stagehand lingering near the piano, his eyes on Duval with a mixture of awe and resentment. The company, she thought, was a web of loyalties and grudges, each strand taut with possibility. Leaving the studio, Miss Marple walked slowly back to the village, her mind turning over Duval's words. His temper was evident, his pride palpable, but his unease suggested more. A secret, perhaps, tied to that gleaming watch or his clashes with Clara. She thought of a village solicitor whose polished exterior had hidden a gambling habit. Duval's desperation, she suspected, might stem from similar pressures. At her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to her thoughts. The choreographer's temper was a spark, but whether it had ignited murder remained to be seen. She would watch him, and the others, for the truth, like a dancer's misstep, would reveal itself in time. Chapter 5. The Rival's Tears. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the village's cobblestone paths and the ivy-clad walls of the inn where the Varney Ballet Company was lodged. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked with a purposeful yet unhurried step toward the inn, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The morning's visit to Maurice Duval had sharpened her curiosity about Elise Caro, the understudy whose dry-eyed grief and sudden prominence in the company hinted at depths yet unexplored. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through the masks people wore, sensed that Elise's performance, both on stage and off, merited a closer look. The inn's common room was quiet, the dancers having retreated to their rooms after a tense rehearsal. Mr. Dobbs, the landlord, polishing glasses behind the bar, greeted Miss Marple with a nod. "Miss Caro's upstairs, second door on the left," he said, anticipating her inquiry. "Poor lass hasn't come down all day, says she's too upset." His tone held a trace of skepticism, and Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. She thanked him and ascended the narrow staircase, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet, her mind recalling a village girl whose tears had once masked a cunning theft. Elise's room was small but tidy, its single window overlooking the village green. She sat at a dressing table, her auburn curls loose, her face pale without the stage makeup that had accentuated her delicate features the night before. A small mirror, its edges chipped, reflected her as she turned at Miss Marple's soft knock. "Oh, Miss Marple," Elise said, her voice quavering. "How kind of you to come." She rose, gesturing to a chair, her movements graceful but calculated, like a dancer stepping into a familiar role. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting bag on her lap, her eyes noting the room's details. A neatly folded costume on the bed, a pair of point shoes by the door, a photograph of Clara Varney pinned to the wall, its edges curling slightly. "I wanted to offer my condolences," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle as a lullaby. "You and Clara must have been close, sharing the same stage." Elisa's eyes glistened, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips, though Miss Marple noted the cloth remained dry. She was an inspiration, Elise said, her voice soft but measured. But she could be so cruel, you know, always reminding me I was her understudy, never her equal. Her words carried a rehearsed quality, and Miss Marple thought of a young governess in St. Mary Mead, whose complaints about her employer had hidden a deeper resentment. "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit. It must have been hard, always in her shadow. Elise nodded, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. "It was. I worked so hard, but Clara got all the praise, all the roles. I only wanted a chance to shine." Her voice broke, but her eyes, Miss Marple observed, remained sharp, watching for a reaction. The old lady's smile was sympathetic, but her mind was cataloging. Elise's costume on the bed, tailored to Clara's measurements, suggested preparation, perhaps anticipation. "And last night," Miss Marple continued, her tone as casual as if discussing a village fete, "you were in your dressing room, I believe, during the final act?" Elise nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, I was preparing for the curtain call. I didn't see anything, I swear." Her words were firm, but her fingers tightened on the handkerchief, and Miss Marple noted a faint flush on her cheeks. She recalled a village seamstress who had lied about her whereabouts during a theft, her nervousness betrayed by such small signs. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "It must have been a shock, finding poor Clara like that." Elise's eyes darted to the photograph on the wall, and for a moment her composure faltered. "It was horrible," she whispered. "That ribbon around her throat, it was hers, you know, from her costume." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. The ribbon, unique to Clara, was a clue that pointed to someone with access to her wardrobe, someone like Elise, who shared her dressing room. "How curious," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Such a personal thing to use." Elise nodded, her lips trembling, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way her gaze flicked to the mirror, as if checking her reflection, or something beyond it. Rising, Miss Marple moved to the window, ostensibly to admire the view, but her eyes scanned the room's reflection in the glass. The mirror on the dressing table, she noted, was angled to catch the hallway outside, where the stage door lay just beyond. A dancer in this room could have seen Clara's movements, could have timed an ambush. She thought of a village girl who had used a mirror to spy on a rival, her jealousy leading to a petty crime. Elise's mirror, she suspected, held more than vanity. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, turning back to Elise with a smile. "You've been most helpful." Elise's relief was palpable, but her eyes followed Miss Marple to the door, wary and guarded. As Miss Marple descended the stairs, her mind wove the threads of Elise's words and silences. The rival's tears were a performance, she thought, as carefully choreographed as any dance. But for whom? And to what end? Outside, the village was stirring, the news of Clara's murder spreading like ripples in a pond. Miss Marple paused by the green, her eyes on the inn's upper windows. Elise's ambition, her proximity to Clara, her convenient alibi, all were strands in a pattern that was beginning to take shape. She recalled a village wedding where a bridesmaid's tears had hidden a scheme to upstage the bride. Elise's grief, she suspected, was no less calculated. As she walked back to her cottage, her knitting bag swinging gently, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the ribbon, the mirror, the costume, each a clue, each a step in the dance of murder she was determined to unravel. Chapter 6. The Stage Manager's Secrets. The late afternoon light filtered through the high windows of the St. Mary Mead Assembly Hall, casting long, slanting beams across the stage where Clara Varney had met her end. The air still carried the faint scent of rosin and grease paint, a ghostly reminder of the performance now overshadowed by tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the worn floorboards, had returned to the scene of the crime, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. She had come to speak with Tom Rigby, the stage manager, whose brusque manner and curious bruise had lingered in her mind like an unresolved chord. The hall was quiet, the dancers absent, but Rigby was there, as she had expected, fussing with a tangle of ropes near the stage's wings. Rigby was a man of middle years, his stocky frame hunched over his work, his thinning hair damp with sweat despite the cool air. His clipboard, ever present, lay propped against a crate, its pages curling from use. As Miss Marple approached, her shadow fell across the ropes, and he started, his hands jerking as if caught in some guilty act. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but unsteady. "Didn't hear you come in." His small eyes darted to the stage door, then back to her, and Miss Marple noted the bruise on his wrist, now more pronounced, a purplish mark peeking from his rolled-up sleeve. "I do apologize for startling you, Mr. Rigby," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "I thought I might find you here, keeping things in order. Such a dreadful business last night." She settled onto a nearby stool, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a soft clink. Rigby grunted, returning to his ropes, but his movements were stiff, as if her presence were a weight he could not shake. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in the scene. The ropes, neatly coiled but slightly frayed. The clipboard, its top page marked with hurried scrawls, and Rigby's hands, which trembled faintly as he worked. "Clara must have kept you busy," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking in a soothing rhythm. "I hear she was particular about her lighting, her cues, everything just so." Rigby's jaw tightened, and he nodded, his eyes fixed on the ropes. "She was a terror," he muttered, "always wanting the spotlights brighter, the curtains faster. Nothing was ever good enough." His voice held a bitterness that Miss Marple recognized, recalling a village shopkeeper who had grumbled about a demanding customer, his resentment simmering into spite. "It must have been exhausting," she said sympathetically, "to meet such exacting standards." Rigby's hands paused, and he glanced at her, his expression wary. "I managed," he said shortly. "It's my job, isn't it? Keep the show running, no matter what." But his tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers brushed the bruise, as if it pained him. She thought of a local blacksmith, whose rough exterior had hidden a secret quarrel that left marks not unlike Rigby's. "And last night," she continued, her voice as casual as if discussing a parish meeting, "you were at the lighting board, I believe, during the final act?" Rigby nodded, his eyes narrowing. "That's right, checking the cues, like always. Didn't see nothing until they found her." His voice faltered, and he busied himself with the ropes, his movements jerky. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind turning over his words. The lighting board was at the back of the hall, far from the stage door where Clara was found, but the bruise suggested a struggle, or perhaps a moment of temper. "How curious," she said softly, "that no one saw you there. It must have been a busy night with so much to manage. Rigby's face flushed, and he tugged his sleeve down, covering the bruise. "It was hectic," he said curtly. "I don't keep track of who's watching me." His tone was sharp, but Miss Marple's smile remained serene, her eyes noting the clipboard's top page, a schedule with Clara's name circled in red ink, a scribbled note beside it. Too much. She recalled a village clerk whose meticulous records had betrayed his hidden anger at a colleague. Rigby's clipboard, she suspected, might hold similar secrets. As she rose, feigning interest in a nearby prop table, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the stage. A faint scuff mark on the floor near the stage door caught her attention, a smudge of black, as if from a shoe, too small for a stagehand's boot. She thought of a village girl who had left a mark in the dust while sneaking into a rival's garden. "You must know every inch of this stage," she said, turning back to Rigby. "Did you notice anything unusual last night? A prop out of place, perhaps, or someone where they shouldn't be?" Rigby hesitated, his hands stilling on the ropes. "Everything was in order," he said, but his eyes flicked to the stage door, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting shadow of doubt. "Just the usual chaos after a show." She nodded, her mind filing away his hesitation, the scuff mark, the bruise. As she thanked him and moved toward the door, she paused by the prop table, where a small wrench lay half hidden under a cloth. Its handle bore a faint smear of grease paint, the same shade Clara had worn. Miss Marple's fingers itched to examine it, but she left it untouched, knowing Constable Tompkins must see it first. Outside, the village was settling into evening, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving a pattern from Rigby's secrets. His resentment of Clara, his bruise, his vague alibi. All were threads in the tapestry of murder. She recalled a village carpenter whose quiet grudges had led to a broken fence and a broken trust. Rigby's secrets, she suspected, were no less telling. At her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to her racing mind. The stage manager's world, she knew, was one of control and precision. Yet something had slipped, leaving a mark as clear as that scuff on the floor. She would follow that mark and the others until the pattern of Clara's death was complete. Chapter 7. The Fan's Devotion. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill that seemed to seep into the bones, and the village inn glowed like a beacon against the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, made her way to the inn, her knitting bag a familiar companion at her side. The day's encounters, with Duval's temper, Elise's calculated tears, and Rigby's guarded secrets, had woven a complex web in her mind. But it was Henry Tate, the ardent fan, who now drew her attention. His fervent applause, his wilting roses, and his lingering presence backstage on the night of Clara Varney's murder suggested a devotion that might border on something darker. Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for seeing beneath the surface, resolved to unravel the threads of his obsession. The inn's common room was subdued, the usual chatter of travelers muted by the shadow of the ballet company's tragedy. Mr. Dobbs, the landlord, polishing a tankard behind the bar, nodded as Miss Marple entered. "Mr. Tate's in his room," he said, his voice low, as if wary of being overheard. "Haven't seen him much today. Just sits up there, writing letters, muttering about Miss Varney." His eyes held a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple thanked him with a smile, her mind noting the landlord's wariness. She recalled a village postman whose devotion to a local widow had turned to meddling in her affairs. Tate's fixation, she suspected, might follow a similar path. Ascending the creaking staircase, Miss Marple knocked softly on Tate's door, her manner as unassuming as a neighbor calling for tea. The door opened to reveal Henry Tate, his soft face lined with fatigue, his eyes red-rimmed but alert. The room was small, cluttered with mementos of Clara Varney, photographs pinned to the walls, a stack of programs on a rickety table, and a velvet-lined box containing what appeared to be a lock of dark hair, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. A bouquet of roses, now drooping pitifully, sat in a chipped vase by the window. "Miss Marple," Tate said, his voice trembling with a mix of surprise and eagerness. "You've come about, Clara, haven't you? Please, sit." He gestured to a chair, his hands shaking as he cleared a pile of letters from its seat. Miss Marple settled in, her knitting bag on her lap, her eyes taking in the room's shrine-like atmosphere. "You were very fond of Miss Varney," she began, her tone gentle, as if discussing a favorite book. "Her performances must have been a joy to watch." Tate's face lit up, his hands clasping together as if in prayer. "She was divine," he said, his voice fervent. "Every step, every gesture. She was more than a dancer. She was a vision. I've followed her from London to Bristol, every show I could afford." His eyes drifted to the photographs, and Miss Marple noted the intensity of his gaze, like a village boy who had once mooned over a traveling singer, his adoration teetering on obsession. "How wonderful to have such appreciation," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit. "You were backstage last night, I believe, hoping for an autograph?" Tate nodded, his flush deepening. "Yes, I always try to see her after a performance. She smiled at me once, in Bath. Did I tell you? It was like the sun breaking through clouds." His voice wavered, and he reached for a letter, half finished, its ink smudged as if written in haste. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the letter, noting the looping script, the words, "My angel," scrawled repeatedly. She thought of a young clerk in St. Mary Mead, whose love letters had hidden a dangerous fixation. "And did you see her last night?" she asked, her tone as mild as if inquiring about the weather. Tate's hands stilled, his eyes darting to the roses. "No, I was near the stage door, but it was crowded. Dancers, stagehands, all rushing about. I didn't get close." His voice was earnest, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of hesitation, a slight tremor in his fingers. She recalled a village lad whose devotion to a local beauty had led to stolen trinkets, his guilt betrayed by such small tells. "How sad," she said, her smile sympathetic. "And did you notice anything unusual? Someone out of place, perhaps?" Tate shook his head, his fingers twisting the edge of a program. "It was chaos, like always after a show. I saw that choreographer Duval shouting at someone, and the stage manager, Rigby, he was near the ropes. But I wasn't looking, not really. I just wanted her autograph." His eyes filled with tears, and this time they spilled over, though Miss Marple noted the way he glanced at her, as if gauging her reaction. She thought of a village widow whose tears had masked a scheme to deflect suspicion. Tate's devotion, she suspected, might hide a similar artifice. Rising, Miss Marple moved to the window, ostensibly to adjust her shawl, but her eyes scanned the room's details. The velvet box, she noted, was locked, its key tucked into Tate's waistcoat pocket. The roses, their petals falling, matched the single bloom found near Clara's body, a detail too precise to be coincidence. "These are lovely," she said, gesturing to the vase. "Did you bring them for Clara last night?" Tate nodded, his face crumpling. "I always brought her roses. She never took them, but I left them backstage, hoping—" His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's mind seized on the image of the discarded rose, its stem crushed as if dropped in haste. "Thank you, Mr. Tate," she said, her tone warm but her eyes sharp. "You've been very kind to share your memories of Clara." Tate nodded, his hands clutching the program as if it were a lifeline. As Miss Marple descended the stairs, her thoughts turned over his words, his tears, his shrine. His devotion was palpable, but its intensity suggested a passion that could turn to rage if spurned. She recalled a village shopkeeper whose obsession with a customer had led to a public outburst. Tate's roses, she thought, were a thread that tied him to the stage, and perhaps to the crime. Outside, the village was cloaked in twilight, the inn's lights casting a warm glow against the darkening sky. Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the upper windows, where Tate's silhouette moved restlessly. His devotion, his presence backstage, his trembling hands, all were strands in the pattern she was weaving. She thought of a village dance, where a spurned suitor's smile had hidden a heart full of spite. Tate's love for Clara, she suspected, might have twisted into something fatal. As she walked to her cottage, her knitting bag swinging gently, Miss Marple resolved to follow the trail of the roses, for in their wilted petals she sensed a clue to the truth. Chapter 8. The Ribbon's Tale. The morning mist had settled into a fine drizzle over St. Mary Mead, veiling the village in a soft, gray haze that seemed to mirror the uncertainty surrounding Clara Varney's murder. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, made her way to the assembly hall, her umbrella bobbing like a small black beacon. Her knitting bag, ever present, swung gently at her side, its contents a quiet reminder of the patterns she was weaving in her mind. The crimson ribbon that had ended Clara's life was no mere prop. It was a clue that spoke of intimacy and intent, and Miss Marple intended to trace its story. The hall, though silent now, held secrets in its shadows, and she was determined to coax them into the light. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of dust and faded flowers. The stage, stripped of its Giselle scenery, was a stark expanse of worn boards, but the memory of Clara's final performance lingered like a ghost. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, settled on the costume rack near the stage door, where a few garments still hung, their silks and tools catching the dim light. She had arranged to meet Mrs. Pym, the company's costume mistress, a wiry woman with a reputation for precision and a tongue sharpened by years of managing temperamental dancers. Mrs. Pym, bustling in with a pincushion strapped to her wrist, greeted Miss Marple with a nod, her eyes wary but curious. "Constable Tompkins said you'd be coming," she said, her voice brisk. "Something about the ribbon, I suppose?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone as gentle as a village tea party. "It's such a distinctive piece, that crimson ribbon. I thought you might tell me more about it." She settled onto a stool by the rack, her knitting needles emerging with a soft clink, their rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the grim task at hand. Mrs. Pym's hands paused over a pile of mending, her lips pursing. "It was Clara's, specially dyed for her Giselle costume," she said. "No one else had one like it, deep red, silk, imported from France. Cost a pretty penny, too." Her tone held a hint of pride, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if the ribbon's fate weighed on her. "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking steadily. "And who had access to it? The dancers, I presume?" Mrs. Pym nodded, her fingers threading a needle with practiced ease. Clara's costume was kept in her dressing room, shared with Elise Caro. The dancers handle their own costumes before a show, but I check everything after. That ribbon was in place during the performance. I saw it myself. Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the way her needle hesitated, as if her thoughts had snagged on something. She recalled a village seamstress who had once overlooked a missing button, her oversight revealing a theft. "And after the performance?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. "Was the ribbon still with Clara's things?" Mrs. Pym frowned, her hands stilling. "I didn't check right away. There was such a fuss with the scream and all, but it should have been in the dressing room, unless someone took it." Her eyes darted to the stage door, where Clara's body had been found, and Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the proximity. The dressing room was mere steps away, a narrow corridor connecting it to the stage. Someone familiar with the layout, someone like Elise or even Rigby, could have slipped in and out unnoticed. She thought of a village girl who had used a back door to pilfer a neighbor's jam, her path as calculated as a dancer's steps. Miss Marple rose, her umbrella tapping the floor as she moved to the dressing room door. "Might I see where the costumes were kept?" she asked, her voice as polite as if requesting a recipe. Mrs. Pym led the way, her steps brisk but her expression guarded. The dressing room was cramped, its walls lined with mirrors and hooks, a faint scent of powder and perfume lingering in the air. Clara's costume, minus the fatal ribbon, hung on a rack, its white tulle pristine, but for a faint smudge of grease paint on the bodice. Elise's costume, neatly folded, sat on a nearby chair. Its measurements, Miss Marple noted, almost identical to Clara's. A small mirror on the dressing table caught her eye, its angle reflecting the corridor and the stage door beyond. She recalled her visit to Elise, the mirror's strategic position suggesting more than vanity. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing the mirror's frame. "This would give quite a view of anyone coming or going." Mrs. Pym nodded, her lips tightening. "The girls like to keep an eye on things. Dancers are particular about their space." Miss Marple's mind turned to a village shop girl who had used a mirror to watch for a rival's approach, her motives far from innocent. The ribbon, she thought, could have been taken by someone who knew Clara's movements, someone who saw her pass through that corridor. "And no one else came in here after the show?" she asked, her tone casual. Mrs. Pym shook her head. "Not that I saw, but it was chaos, dancers rushing about, stagehands clearing props. I was busy mending a torn skirt." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the way. Her hands clutched the pincushion, as if anchoring herself against the memory. She thanked Mrs. Pym, her smile warm, but her mind racing. The ribbon's tale was one of access and opportunity, pointing to someone within the company's inner circle, someone who could move unseen in the post-performance frenzy. As she left the hall, the drizzle had softened to a mist, cloaking the village in a dream-like haze. Miss Marple paused by the stage door, her eyes tracing the path from the dressing room to the spot where Clara had fallen. The ribbon, dyed for Clara, was a deliberate choice, its knot tied with a precision that suggested a steady hand. She thought of a village widow who had used a scarf to conceal a stolen brooch, the personal nature of the item betraying her intent. The ribbon's story, Miss Marple knew, was intertwined with the killer's, and she would follow its threads through the dressing room, the mirror, the corridor, until the truth was laid bare. At her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to her thoughts. The ribbon, the mirror, the costume, all were clues in a dance of deception. She recalled a village fete where a girl's careful smile had hidden a heart full of malice. The killer, she suspected, was no less skilled at concealment. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles wove a pattern, each stitch a step closer to unraveling the mystery of Clara's death. Chapter 9. A Village Clue. The drizzle had ceased by midday, leaving St. Mary Mead glistening under a weak sun that struggled through the clouds. Miss Jane Marple, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, walked briskly along the village's high street, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The morning's visit to the assembly hall had sharpened her focus on the crimson ribbon, its deliberate use pointing to someone with intimate access to Clara Varney's world. But it was the village itself, with its ceaseless chatter and watchful eyes, that often revealed truths overlooked by official inquiries. Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for sifting gossip from fact, headed to the village shop, where tongues wagged as freely as the bell above the door. The shop, a cramped space filled with jars of sweets and stacks of tinned goods, was presided over by Miss Weatherby, a sharp-eyed spinster whose memory for village happenings rivaled Miss Marple's own. As Miss Marple entered, the bell jingled, and Miss Weatherby looked up from her ledger, her face brightening. "Miss Marple, come for your wool, or is it news of that dreadful business at the hall?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Miss Marple smiled, setting her bag on the counter. "A bit of both, perhaps," she said, her tone as mild as a summer afternoon. "The village is all aflutter, and I thought you might have heard something useful." Miss Weatherby's eyes gleamed, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Oh, there's talk aplenty. That ballet lot, they're a queer bunch. My nephew's boy, Tommy, delivers milk to the inn, and he saw something odd last night." She paused for effect, and Miss Marple's needles, now in hand, clicked softly, encouraging her to continue. "Go on," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "What did young Tommy see?" Miss Weatherby straightened, savoring the moment. He was late with his rounds, past 10, and saw that understudy, Miss Caro, leaving the hall. Hurrying she was, with a red scarf in her hand, or so he thought. Could have been that ribbon, couldn't it? Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. A red scarf, mistaken for the crimson ribbon in the dim light, placed Elise Caro at the hall after her claimed alibi of being in her dressing room. She recalled a village lass who had been seen slipping out of a barn, her shawl hiding stolen apples. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And was Tommy certain it was Miss Caro?" Miss Weatherby nodded vigorously. "Oh, yes, he knows her by sight, those red curls of hers. You can't miss them. He said she looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid of being followed." The shop bell jingled again, admitting Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, whose basket was laden with gossip as much as groceries. "Talking about the murder, are you?" she said, joining them at the counter. "I heard something myself from my cousin at the inn. That choreographer, Monsieur Duval, he's not as grand as he seems. Owes money all over London, gambling debts, they say. That fancy watch of his? Not a gift, like he claims, but bought on credit he can't pay. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her mind filing away the information. Duval's desperation, she thought, might have pushed him to extremes, especially if Clara's defiance threatened his reputation. She recalled a village merchant whose debts had led to a desperate act of forgery. And that's not all, Mrs. Price continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. My cousin's girl found letters in Mr. Rigby's room when she was cleaning, love letters to Clara, all crumpled like he was ashamed of them. She spurned him, I'd wager, and a man scorned can be dangerous. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Rigby's bruise, his curt manner, now took on a new light. She thought of a village lad whose unrequited love had turned to vandalism, his hurt pride leaving marks as telling as Rigby's wrist. As the women chatted, Miss Marple's mind wove their words into the pattern she was building. Tommy's sighting of Elise, Duval's debts, Rigby's letters, each was a thread, distinct yet connected. She thanked Miss Weatherby and Mrs. Price, purchasing a skein of blue wool to maintain her pretext, and stepped back into the street. The village, with its watchful eyes, had given her a clue that Constable Tompkins, with his notebooks and bluster, might have missed. She resolved to speak with Tommy, the milk boy, to confirm his story. But first she would revisit the inn, where the company's secrets seemed to gather like dust in the corners. At the inn, Miss Marple found Tommy unloading milk bottles, his freckled face bright with the importance of being noticed. Miss Weatherby said you saw something last night, Tommy, she said, her voice gentle but probing. The boy nodded, his eyes wide. It was Miss Caro, sure as anything. She came out the hall's side door, holding a red thing, scarf, maybe, or that ribbon. Looked like she was in a rush, kept looking back. Miss Marple smiled, slipping him a shilling for his trouble. His account, untainted by adult calculation, rang true, and it placed Elise in a lie that could unravel her alibi. As she walked back to her cottage, the village settling into the quiet of early afternoon, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the clues that were mounting. Elise's false alibi, Duval's financial strain, Rigby's rejected affection, and Tate's obsessive devotion. Each suspect was a player in a drama of ambition and resentment, their motives as tangled as the wool in her bag. She recalled a village fête where a girl's careless glance had betrayed her theft of a rival's prize. The village's clue, she knew, was a step toward the truth, and she would follow it, through the inn, the hall, and the shadows of human nature, until Clara's killer was revealed. At her fireside, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the crackle of the flames, Miss Marple's mind wove the day's findings into her pattern. The red scarf, the debts, the letters. All were strands in a web that centered on Clara's death. She thought of a village wedding where a spurned guest's smile had hidden a heart full of malice. The killer, she suspected, was no less adept at concealment, but the village's eyes had seen something, and Miss Marple would ensure that vision led to justice. Chapter 10. The Performance of Guilt. The evening shadows stretched long across St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a hush that seemed to hold its breath. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl neatly pinned, walked toward the assembly hall, where Constable Tompkins had agreed to gather the suspects for what he called a formal inquiry. Miss Marple, invited at his behest, knew such gatherings often revealed more through silences than words. Her knitting bag, a quiet companion, swung gently at her side, its contents a reminder of the intricate pattern she was weaving from the threads of motive, opportunity, and deceit. The crimson ribbon, Elise's false alibi, Duval's debts, Rigby's spurned affection, and Tate's obsession, all were strands converging on this moment, and Miss Marple was ready to test their strength. The hall's interior was lit by gas lamps, their flickering light casting a theatrical glow over the stage, now bare, but for a few chairs arranged in a semicircle. Constable Tompkins stood at the center, his notebook clutched like a shield, his youthful face strained with the weight of authority. The suspects, Maurice Duval, Elise Caro, Tom Rigby, and Henry Tate, sat uneasily, their postures betraying the tension of a performance they had not rehearsed. Miss Marple took a seat at the edge, her needles clicking softly, her presence as unassuming as a shadow, yet her eyes missed nothing. Duval's restless fingers, Elise's rigid composure, Rigby's fidgeting, Tate's trembling hands. Tompkins cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he began. "We're here to sort out what happened to Miss Varney," he said, glancing at Miss Marple for reassurance. "Each of you was near the stage that night, and we need clear answers." His words were met with silence, broken only by the creak of a chair as Duval shifted, his hawk-like face taut with impatience. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, spoke softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a gentle breeze. "It's a dreadful thing, murder," she said, her eyes sweeping the group. "But it leaves traces, like steps in a dance. Shall we go over the night's performance?" She began with Duval, her tone mild but probing. "Monsieur Duval, you were in the wings, directing the curtain call, yet no one recalls seeing you there after the final bow." Duval's eyes narrowed, his gold watch glinting as he crossed his arms. "I was there, then in my office," he snapped. "Clara's death is a tragedy, but I had no part in it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Of course. Yet your debts, I hear, were pressing. Debts that Clara's defiance might have worsened, threatening your reputation." Duval's face flushed, but he said nothing, his silence louder than words. She recalled a village merchant whose financial straits had led to desperate lies. Turning to Rigby, she continued, her voice as calm as a vicarage tea. "Mr. Rigby, you were at the lighting board, but a bruise on your wrist suggests a struggle, and letters found in your room speak of feelings for Clara, feelings she did not return." Rigby's hand jerked to his sleeve, his eyes darting to the stage door. "I never touched her," he muttered. "Those letters were private, nothing more." Miss Marple's smile was sympathetic, but her mind noted his defensiveness, like a village lad caught in a petty theft. Tate, his hands clutching a wilted rose, was next. "Mr. Tate, your devotion to Clara was touching, but you were backstage, near her body, with roses like the one found at the scene." Tate's eyes filled with tears, his voice trembling. "I loved her. I'd never hurt her. I just wanted her to notice me." His anguish was real, but Miss Marple recalled a village boy whose obsession had turned to spite, and she wondered if Tate's love had soured into something darker. Finally, she turned to Elise, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "Miss Caro, you said you were in your dressing room, yet a village boy saw you leaving the hall holding a red scarf, or perhaps the ribbon that killed Clara." Elise's face paled, her hands twisting her shawl. "That's nonsense," she said, her voice sharp. "I was nowhere near the stage." But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the mirror in her mind's eye, angled to watch the stage door. "The ribbon," she said softly, "was tied with a dancer's precision, a knot only someone like you could manage. And your costume, ready to take Clara's place, suggests you were prepared for her absence." The room grew still, the suspects' eyes darting between each other, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple's needles clicked, a metronome to the mounting tension. "Clara's death was no accident," she said. "It was a performance, planned and executed by someone who knew her movements, her costume, her world." She paused, her eyes resting on Elise, whose composure was fraying like a worn thread. The others watched, their masks slipping, revealing fear, guilt, or relief. Miss Marple rose, her shawl neat, her voice steady. "The truth, like a dance, requires precision. We shall find it, step by step." As Tompkins resumed his questions, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting a quiet anchor. The performance of guilt, she knew, was nearing its climax, and the killer's misstep was close at hand. She recalled a village play where an actor's glance had betrayed his role. Tonight, she thought, the stage was set for a revelation. Chapter 11. The Confession. The assembly hall in St. Mary Mead, bathed in the dim glow of gas lamps, seemed to hold its breath as the inquiry reached its peak. The stage, stripped of its theatrical trappings, was a stark arena, where the suspects, Maurice Duval, Elise Caro, Tom Rigby, and Henry Tate, sat in their uneasy semicircle, their faces illuminated by flickering light that cast long shadows. Constable Tompkins, his notebook trembling in his hands, stood at the center, his authority bolstered by Miss Jane Marple's quiet presence at the edge of the stage. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that seemed to anchor the room's tension, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles as she watched the drama unfold. The threads of the case, the crimson ribbon, the mirror's angle, the village boy's sighting, had woven a pattern that pointed inexorably to one figure, and Miss Marple was ready to draw it taut. Tompkins, emboldened by Miss Marple's earlier words, pressed on with his questions, but it was her voice, gentle yet piercing, that cut through the air. "Murder," she said, her tone as calm as if discussing a parish meeting, "is a deliberate act, like a dance choreographed with care. Clara Varney's death was no accident. It was planned, executed with a ribbon from her own costume, tied by a hand that knew her intimately." Her eyes swept the group, lingering on each suspect, noting Duval's clenched jaw, Rigby's fidgeting fingers, Tate's trembling lips, and Elise's rigid stillness. The room was silent, but for the soft creak of a chair and the distant patter of rain against the hall's windows. "Monsieur Duval," Miss Marple began, her needles pausing for emphasis. "Your temper and debts suggested a motive, but your office, far from the stage door, and your witnesses among the stage hands place you elsewhere." Duval exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though his eyes remained wary. She turned to Rigby. "Mr. Rigby, your bruise and unrequited feelings for Clara hinted at passion, but your letters, though heartfelt, show no violence, and your duties at the lighting board kept you occupied." Rigby's face flushed, but he nodded, his relief palpable. To Tate, she said, "Mr. Tate, your devotion was intense, but your trembling hands could not tie that precise knot, and your roses, though near the body, were a gesture of love, not malice." Tate's tears fell freely, his head bowing in gratitude. Then her gaze settled on Elise Caro, whose pale face was a mask of composure, though her hands twisted her shawl with increasing agitation. "Miss Caro," Miss Marple said softly, "you told us you were in your dressing room, yet a village boy saw you leaving the hall, holding a red scarf, or perhaps the ribbon that ended Clara's life. Your mirror, angled to watch the stage door, gave you a clear view of her movements." Elise's lips parted, but no sound came, her eyes darting to the others as if seeking an escape. Miss Marple continued, her voice unrelenting yet kind. "Clara was your rival, her brilliance a barrier to your ambition. Her role as Giselle was yours by the next performance, your costume tailored to her measurements, ready for your moment." The room grew taut, the suspect's eyes fixed on Elise, whose composure cracked like thin ice. "That's absurd," she cried, her voice sharp but trembling. "I admired Clara. I would never—" Her words faltered as Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture as gentle as a grandmother's. "The ribbon," she said, "was tied with a dancer's precision, a knot only someone like you, trained in grace and control, could manage. You followed her that night, didn't you? Furious at her taunts, her refusal to yield the spotlight." Elise's hands dropped to her lap, her shawl falling away, and Miss Marple saw the truth in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, raw and undeniable. The silence was broken by a sob, and Elise's head bowed, her auburn curls falling across her face. "She mocked me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Always saying I'd never be her, never be Giselle. That night, she laughed at me again, said I'd always be second. I followed her, grabbed the ribbon from her costume. It was just a moment, a flash of rage. I didn't mean to." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her sobs echoing in the hall. Duval gasped, Rigby stared, and Tate wept silently, the weight of the confession settling like dust. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her expression serene, but tinged with sorrow. "Ambition," she said softly, "can twist the heart as tightly as a ribbon." Tompkins, his face pale, stepped forward, his voice steady now. "Miss Caro, you'll come with me," he said, his hand gentle but firm as he helped her to her feet. The others watched, stunned, as Elise was led away, her steps faltering like a dancer who had missed her mark. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting a quiet anchor, her mind reflecting on a village girl whose envy had led to a stolen trinket, her crime revealed by a careless word. Elise's confession, she knew, was the final step in the dance of truth. As the hall emptied, the gas lamps dimming, Miss Marple rose, her shawl neat, her eyes lingering on the stage. The performance of guilt had ended, but its echoes would linger in St. Mary Mead. She thought of a village play where a single line had unmasked a villain. Tonight, the truth had taken center stage, and justice, like a well-rehearsed ballet, had found its rhythm. Chapter 12. The curtain falls. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning of soft sunlight, the clouds parting to reveal a sky as clear as truth unveiled. The assembly hall, scene of Clara Varney's tragic end, stood silent, its doors locked, the echoes of Elise Caro's confession lingering like a final note in a somber melody. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage fire, her knitting needles weaving a scarf, not crimson, but a soothing blue, its pattern simple yet precise, much like the solution she had unraveled. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, a quiet testament to the hours spent threading together the strands of human nature that had led to Clara's death. The village, though stirred by the scandal, was settling back into its familiar rhythm, but Miss Marple's mind remained attuned to the drama that had played out on its stage. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across the parlor, where lace doilies adorned every surface, and a single rose, picked from her garden, not Tate's wilted offerings, stood in a vase. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects, each a player in the tragedy now resolved. Maurice Duval, his temper cooled by relief, had returned to his rehearsals, his debts a shadow he would face another day. Tom Rigby, his bruise fading, had resumed his duties, his unrequited love a private wound that would heal in time. Henry Tate, his devotion shattered, had left the village, his roses abandoned, his obsession a cautionary tale. And Elise Caro, her ambition turned to ashes, awaited justice in a cell, her confession the final bow of a performance gone terribly wrong. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the crimson ribbon, its silken thread the key to the mystery. Its deliberate use, tied with a dancer's precision, had pointed to Elise, whose envy had twisted her talent into a fatal act. Miss Marple recalled a village seamstress, whose jealousy over a rival's needlework had led to a petty sabotage, her guilt revealed by a single misplaced stitch. Elise's crime, though far graver, followed a similar pattern. Ambition, resentment, a moment of rage that tightened a ribbon into a noose. The mirror in her dressing room, angled to watch Clara's movements, had been the silent witness, much like the village's watchful eyes that had seen Elise's hurried exit. She rose, moving to the window, where the village green lay peaceful under the morning sun. The ballet company was preparing to depart, their wagons loaded with costumes and props, their performances forever marked by Clara's absence. Miss Marple's gaze softened, her mind reflecting on the human heart, its passions, its frailties, its capacity for both beauty and destruction. She thought of a village dance where a girl's radiant smile had hidden a heart full of spite. Clara's brilliance, she knew, had been a spotlight that cast shadows, and in those shadows, Elise's envy had grown. Constable Tompkins had visited earlier, his face flushed with gratitude. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, his notebook finally at rest. "I'd have been lost without you." She had smiled, deflecting praise as always, but her mind had noted his earnestness, like a young gardener proud of a well-tended plot. The ribbon, the mirror, the village boy's sighting, all had been clues she had woven together, each as vital as a stitch in her scarf. The truth, she knew, was like a dance. It required patience, precision, and an eye for the smallest misstep. As she returned to her chair, her needles resuming their rhythm, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the broader stage of human nature. Clara's death was a tragedy, but it was also a reminder that no village, no matter how quiet, was immune to the passions that drove men and women to extremes. She recalled a sermon at St. Mary's where the vicar had spoken of forgiveness, but also of justice. Elise's confession had brought the latter, but the former, Miss Marple knew, was a harder path. The scarf grew longer, its blue threads a contrast to the crimson ribbon that had ended a life. Miss Marple sighed, her eyes on the fire, where flames danced like performers on a stage. The Varney Ballet Company would move on, their story altered but not ended. St. Mary Mead would return to its quiet ways, its gossip fading like morning mist. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew that human nature was the truest stage, its dramas never fully resolved. She set her knitting aside, her work done for now. But her, mind alert for the next mystery that would inevitably find its way to her door.